let me get back to where we were, and I want to start with a quick summary of the key events in the 1960s leading up to the momentous decision in July 1965 to create Medicare and along with it Medicaid, both as amendments to the Social Security Act of 1935, which was perhaps the most important piece of 20th century American legislation. Medicare was passed as Title 18, that is Amendment 18, and Medicaid as Title 19. Now, there's an interesting and complicated relationship between those, which goes back to the Kerr-Mills Act of 1960. This is not a bill, as the Farran bill was a bill which never made it through the legislature. This was an act passed by both houses of Congress, sponsored by two quite conservative legislators. Senator Kerr was a Republican from Oklahoma and very conservative, and Representative Mills was a long-standing Southern Democrat, a Dixiecrat, someone who would these days be a Republican with the transformation of those relationships in the latter part of the 20th century. It was meant to be an act to thwart the building momentum for Medicare. It was not a compromised measure. It was an antagonistic, hostile measure that was meant to try to take whatever wind that was billowing in the sails for Medicare, whatever it was called at that point, Farran version of Medicare, and to stop it. It was built on entirely different principles, and it's very important to distinguish those principles because that was also consolidated and institutionalized when Medicare and Medicaid were passed simultaneously in '65. Medicare was a social insurance measure. It was built on the principle of Social Security, and it was closely related in methodology to Social Security. It provided, under federal auspices, uniformly throughout the United States, for all citizens, an earned entitlement. The United States didn't have a birth entitlement or a citizenship entitlement, as many countries do for health care or for anything else for that matter. It was an earned entitlement. Some attempt to acknowledge Americans' long-standing political beliefs about individualism, independence, and all those supposed virtues, but to give people who earned the entitlement by their contributions into the Social Security Fund by mandatory payroll deductions that were matched by their employer and then topped off by federal tax subsidies as needed. Social Security built a pool, and that when you earned the right to that money by reaching the retirement age of 65, or in some cases having certified disabilities that didn't allow you to work, it's all work-related. Whether you have the ability, the capacity to work, for disability acknowledgement through Social Security and Medicare, Social Security, I'm still back at Social Security, or you retire and no longer able to earn salary, you can support yourself by having this earned entitlement. It was considered to be America finally catching up to the Enlightenment initiatives in Europe beginning in the late 19th century and spreading across the continent and elsewhere in the world. This is what a proper social democracy looks like. This is how a social democracy takes care of its citizens. This is also how, as Bismarck understood, a social democracy keeps itself from becoming radicalized and taken over by more militants who think and could easily make inroads with the working population, that the working population is not being properly taken care of. They work, they break their bodies for their work, and then they're discarded like so many used Kleenexes. That's not a civilized society. That's a society that will have turbulence. That is a society in which radical spokesmen will get up there and say, this isn't fair, we've got to take the money away from those fat cats who have it and distribute it to the people who need it. Bismarck understood that a very important stratagem to keep a society stable, to allow electoral institutions to work, to allow workers to remain loyal in their work and to give it all their all, was to have something that would reward them for a lifetime of toil, and that was retirement benefits. And the United States, only in the midst of a depression which convinced many people that the capitalist system had failed and the world was changing and we have to do something different, only then was it possible to pass a measure of that kind. And it passed dramatically. It wasn't the Democrats ramming through something over Republicans. The vote on the Social Security bill, August 8, 1935, it passed the House 372 to 33, with 81 Republicans voting in support. And it passed the Senate 77 to 6, with 16 Republicans supporting the legislation. We will see something like this when we get to the specifics of the Medicare vote. And the people who were promoting Medicare in the late 50s and early 60s were those who were trying to add to the spirit of Social Security, to create a social insurance mechanism, to give people now access to health benefits, which have already been achieved in many more advanced European countries, more advanced than us in terms of social legislation. And it was an earned entitlement that everyone was entitled to equally, no matter where you live, no matter what your skin color, no matter what your income was, and so on. It was in the, you might say, true American democratic spirit. The Kerr-Mills bill, promoted by very conservative, not to say reactionary, political forces, didn't want that vision. They wanted to have a country in which those who had special privilege, who had special benefits, would continue to be in their privileged position, and they didn't want to share it equally across the economic groups, certainly not Southern Democrats and Republicans from states like Oklahoma, certainly not equally among the races. Why should black people be entitled to the same benefits as white people and so on? That was the alternative vision. And it was not based on a social insurance earned entitlement. You put in, you get out. That's what a civilized society is like. It was based on a notion of essentially very stingy welfare. The people who will get benefits from Kerr-Mills were those who had to demonstrate in an embarrassing and demeaning way that they were impoverished. They had to reveal their bank accounts. They had to reveal their assets. They had to be submitted to audits by often very mean, tough-minded state officials. It was done at the state level. It varied from state to state to state because it was done at the state level, not uniformly as a national benefit. And those state officials could be quite stingy and quite racist. So Mills, who came from Arkansas, knew damn well that the officials would be white and some of the clients would presumably be black. And it was just fine with him that many of those whites carried prejudices that would exclude the blacks from getting benefits. That same mentality and the same political dynamic carries over to this day, at least in part, in the 19 states which have refused to extend Medicaid as part of the Affordable Care Act and have held out against it. But we'll get to that later. In any case, this was one of the classic confrontations between a welfare vision, state-based, locally, very selective, demeaning, based on means-tested, and an alternative, progressive, liberal vision based on what people thought of as an enlightened sense of what liberal democracy, social democracy should be about, in which people earn the right to certain benefits and entitlements. Kerr-Mills was rationalized on this basis. Well, the people who are supporting Medicare say that all those over 65 are going to be poor, they're going to be retired, they're going to be sick, they're not going to be able to afford their medical care. Maybe, but I bet you a lot of those folks have the means, or if they don't have the means, it's because they were foolish during their lifetimes and they frittered their money away, they didn't save adequately, and why should we reward them for not being smart enough to save for this rainy day when they needed their resources? If that were possible to do. As an imagine, they could all, we could do it, see, we're well off, and we don't need any special program. But there might be a few really down and out crummy people at the bottom of the social ladder who might demonstrate by demeaning themselves that they could get this welfare benefit, and we'll give it to them. So Kerr Mills said, most of the people 65 and over don't need any special help, and it would be a foolish intrusion, distortion of the American way for government to intrude. And if there are a few who are really hurting, then we could use welfare scrutiny and submit them to all kinds of awful examinations and tests and experiences, and then give them a little couple of bucks to take care of their medical needs. That was the Kerr Mills vision. Why did it pass? Because the U.S. Congress in 1960 hadn't yet reached a level of enlightenment that it did in 1965. There were those who didn't like Kerr Mills, who condemned it, who saw it for what it was, as a demeaning welfare measure, but they didn't have the majority. The majority was in the hands of those, like Kerr Mills, who wanted to make it a very cheap, chintzy, minimalist program, so they could at least have bragging rights. Well, we have something. We're not ignoring these people. We're not cruel and heartless. We have the Kerr Mills program. There were those who predicted that many states wouldn't even enact the Kerr Mills program, even when they had matching federal dollars to help pay for it. And that was true. There were several states that never got around to it. They didn't even care enough to have this crummy, measly program. Many states did implement it, and of course the states that you would predict that would implement it most generously were the ones who did. California, New York, and so on, because at least it was something for poor people, though they preferred leaders of those states Medicare. So Kerr Mills was meant to be an alternative, to stop the growing momentum for Medicare. And the interesting thing about it is that as a political strategy, it failed because the momentum for Medicare kept on building. The Kennedy administration kept on pushing. And then after his assassination, Johnson pushed even harder and more effectively. The various forces that were lined up to promote Medicare continued to line up and to rally and to support the measure both for its philosophy and its practical advantage. And the pressures kept building and building. So there was new bills were introduced. The King-Anderson bill, and these were debated. And then there were various alternatives, the Byrne Amendment, and so on and so forth. But there was strong support, and your best source for this is this handout based on the Quest for Health Care Reform book, especially pages 21 through 25, which talks about the aggressiveness of the Kennedy administration. It talks about the tactics of the opposition and the trotting out of old red baiting, red scare tactics with a new spokesman, this guy, Ronald Reagan, a mediocre Hollywood actor who was notable in the 50s for being head of the Screenwriters Union and revealing those members of the Screenwriters Guild who were, he alleged, members of the Communist Party, for which he was deeply hated by a very significant number of the actors and writers who were part of the Screenwriters. But that's how he began to make his reputation. He was a Democrat initially, but when opportunity struck, he converted to Republican. He took money from the AMA to make a recording. It was on vinyl. You could listen to Ronald Reagan on vinyl, telling you why Medicare was socialized medicine, etc. This is an interesting illustration. There is the actual cover of the record. Ronald Reagan speaks out against socialized medicine, Medicare, and it was found in the archives of the American Medical Association. Surprise, surprise. So the familiar suspects are, again, aligned with one another to try to keep this down, to not allow this rising force, this rising popular enthusiasm for Medicare to build. And there were, in addition to the elderly who were increasingly well mobilized, in addition to organized labor, which was increasingly committed to this and spending its political and financial capital to support it, in addition to liberal organizations, national liberal organizations that were trying to promote it, like the National Association of Social Workers, etc. Promoting it, there were opposition forces, and these sides duked it out. But one of the important elements in the 60s that played an interesting and surprising role in the struggle for Medicare was the civil rights movement. Because leaders of the civil rights movement, especially members of what was called the National Medical Association, which was that association of African American physicians who formed their own association because they realized that the AMA, basing itself on local chapters, was deeply segregated and prejudiced and excluded African American members, no matter how well qualified, from whatever medical school they graduated, either from Howard and Meharry, as traditionally black medical schools, or a few of them from other medical schools. There were a handful in other places. The big push began in the 70s to admit more African Americans to medical school. But there were some, there was leadership. Not only were they excluded from the chapters of the American Medical Association, they were excluded from hospitals, which everywhere in the country, not just in the South, deep or mid, but even in some northern cities, were segregated into the posher institutions for the whites and the municipal institutions, usually on very limited budgets and run down, etc., struggling to survive, for blacks. This cartoon by the brilliant cartoonist Herbert Bloch, known as Herb Bloch, who was such a successful cartoonist over many decades that he won the Pulitzer Prize for political cartooning 3 different times, in the 30s, in the 60s, and in the 90s. This is one of Herb Bloch's brilliant cartoons on page 24 of that handout, in which we have a very sophisticated and well-dressed and apparently well-qualified, you can see his diplomas there, with his MD bag, African-American medical school graduate, being told by the representative of what's said on his coat, the Lily White Hospital, backed up by the Lily White Medical School, saying, as only Herb Bloch could say it with a dig, "Sorry, but you have an incurable skin condition. You're black. You can't be admitted to our medical system." So there were leaders of the civil rights movement who understood these things, knew how important Medicare was for their members, knew even more that Medicare was a wonderful strategic opportunity, because if Medicare was passed, and hospitals would certainly have now very large federal grants and funding to allow them to survive or grow or do whatever they wanted to do, those hospitals might be desperate enough to actually desegregate, to integrate. And the medical societies that supported segregation might be themselves motivated enough to get these benefits, financial benefits. And so you can use the very clever leadership of the civil rights movement and of the National Medical Association, the medical branch of it. They understood that they could use Medicare, if it passed, as carrot and stick to beat American medicine into finally modernizing and becoming the way it should be, with an integrated set of institutions and social organization and so on. And so they joined in this movement for Medicare, and the Johnson administration responded in kind by appointing special people within its administration whose entire job, once Medicare was coming online, was to apply the civil rights laws that also passed under Johnson, and to threaten a hospital: if you don't accept patients on a desegregated basis, then we're removing not only Medicare money, none of your patients, none of your white will get a cent from Medicare from the federal government. We will also take away any other federal grant that might be coming to your institution, which will include research grants for the medical school and so on. That was powerfully persuasive. And so across the country, we had a wave of first reluctant and then increasingly enthusiastic desegregation of institutions. Some try to get around it, but generally it happened. And those who were in leadership of the National Medical Association saw this, joined the forces, and that was part of the growing coalition, the rising support for Medicare around the country. Johnson also, I mentioned this only in passing, won a very, very resounding victory in November 1964 when he ran on his own as president, not the replacement president after Kennedy's assassination in late 63 and into early 64. And he ran against someone, Barry Goldwater, who was seen as a right-wing crazy and a nuclear threat. I don't know if there's any resonance for the present, but nonetheless. Anyway, the country turned against Reagan. Should have. The country turned against Goldwater. Johnson won on a landslide victory. More Democrats than were already there to create some very significant majorities in the Senate and Congress got elected. Committee structures and relationships shifted, and it now looked like Medicare was going to be an inevitable outcome. In order to make sure that it would pass, the leadership in Congress was willing to make political deals. So if the AMA and their supporters tried to oppose Medicare, which part was for hospital, mandatory hospital insurance, the Byrne bill, which was also elder care, which was supported by the AMA, said, well, what about us, the doctors? We're not going to get anything out of this. We need to have another piece. We'll call it Medicare Part B. If Medicare passes, Medicare Part A will be mandatory hospital insurance. Medicare Part B will be voluntary physician insurance if people want to take it out. So these two things got put together, and Mills, who was the same Mills of Kerr Mills, understood that we're going to have a greatly expanded black electorate because the civil rights laws had just passed. And many people were being enfranchised and encouraged to vote. And people like Mills from Arkansas suddenly had, oh my God, a significant number of black constituents who now actually could vote. And that meant that they had to think of other ways of trying to satisfy this population. And one way was to take the very narrow, limited Kerr Mills program and extend it, that was just for poor over 65, extend that across the age spectrum and make the qualifications for Medicaid much more liberal and generous. Some states never caught on, but many did, and Medicaid now looked like a politically useful program for Southern politicians who were being discredited by the civil rights movement and by some of their political stances, now trying to reinvent themselves and come out looking like they were on the side of enlightenment. So here was the vote when all that was put together, this composite three-layered cake. Layer 1, Medicare Part A, mandatory hospital insurance, the original proposal. Layer 2, Medicare Part B, voluntary physician insurance, which was the AMA proposal, meant as an alternative but now incorporated. And Medicaid, Title 19, which was originally in Kerr Mills form, more limited form, meant to be oppositional, now incorporated as part of the whole three-layered package. When that was put together, given the mood of the country, given the political circumstances, it came to a vote on July 27th, 1965 in the House. Unless you think our current political system and the complete polarization of Democrats and Republicans and the absence of real bipartisanship of any kind is an inherent fact of American political life, think again. You heard what the vote was for Social Security. It was meant to be Social Security amendments. On July 27, 1965, the House voted for this composite 307 to 116, essentially 3-1, with 70 Republicans supporting the Medicare bill, now law. And on July 28, 1965, the Senate voted on the final composite version of the bill, 70 in favor, 24 opposed. That's almost 4-1, 3.5-1. With 13 Republicans voting in favor of the bill. There was bipartisanship. There was very major support for it, and the measures went into place. Wilbur Mills made a very interesting comment when all this was happening. He said, well, it looks like in this form, I don't still a very conservative political figure. I'm not that worried about this ruining the country and making it socialized and all that, because in these measures, he said, there are two fences around Medicare. These were his exact words. Fences around Medicare, Wilbur Mills. What did that mean? Well, he was smart enough to realize that the majority would be feeling its strength, he thought, many thought, and would soon go beyond this peculiar version of universal health insurance in the U.S. that is defined by a particular age demographic for those 65 and older. No other country in the world has ever done anything like this. The United States was uniquely loopy in doing it this way. And they did it because it was the only political path forward. It was the practical possibility. Yet those who designed it had the hopes that once it was passed, people would soon say, well, this is crazy. Why don't we just extend it through the age spectrum, like everywhere else? Why don't we be like Germany and France and England and Canada and so, well, Canada hadn't yet got there. They were on their way. Why don't we extend it through the age spectrum? And it was exactly that glimmer in the eyes of the proponents that Wilbur Mills sensed and his allies sensed. And so they were very happy about this three-layered structure of Medicare and Medicaid, because there were two fences around Medicare. That is Part A. Medicare could expand across the age spectrum, theoretically, unless it were contained by containment fences. Part B is one containment fence. So you can't say, well, people need more robust insurance. You already have it on an optional basis. If you want it, you can get it Part B. So it acts not only to please the physicians in the AMA, because they might be able to get some additional benefit from this if people have individual physician insurance, but they would also benefit by finding a way to say, well, we already got a universal program. Why do you want to expand it across the age spectrum? And if you want something optional, you have Medicare Part B. You don't need to make Medicare any more robust. And for those people who say, but look, there are a lot of people who still don't have insurance. They're still struggling. They're still poor. They're still in rotten health, and they don't have anything. And you can say, well, for those of you who may need it, you can always have Medicaid. Though it's demeaning and based on welfare principles and administered unfairly by states in very different ways and racist and so on and so forth, you have Medicaid. So you don't need a national program. You're 53 years old and you're poor and you need medical care. Just apply for your local welfare office and we'll get you Medicaid and you'll be just fine. It wasn't true. It wasn't real. But it was politically effective. It was a brilliant rhetorical stratagem, and that was the second major fence, to keep Medicare Part A from expanding into a universal program. It turns out that in a couple of years, as we'll come back to a bit later in the course, there were exactly those, not least Teddy Kennedy, who tried to take Medicare and expand it to Medicare across the age spectrum, and to create a new push for national health insurance. That was one of the most important political phenomena of the late 60s and into the 70s. But we're not there yet. We're in 1965. We have Medicare passing with these special features and conditions, and it then had a strong political base in that form. And the last part of that handout is blurry and fuzzy, but I think you can see the essence of that. It's Lyndon Johnson with his wife Lady Bird behind his right shoulder, looking on as he signs the Medicare measure July 30th, 1965. Sitting to his left is the retired President Harry Truman, looking quite old and rather weak. And behind him is his wife, Bess Truman. This is a very important moment. It was not a ceremony deliberately in the Rose Garden or the Oval Office. Johnson had the whole presidential entourage fly out to Independence, Missouri, which is where the Trumans were living in retirement, as a very special gesture of respect for President Truman. And as he handed him one of the pens, this is a typical ceremony, a major piece of legislation was signed, gave a pen to President Truman. He said, "Mr. President, this is for you," meaning an acknowledgement of your struggle to get national health insurance. We're not all the way there, but this is something. And the first two Medicare cards were issued. At the moment, card number 1, this may be useful in a trivia contest someday, who got the first two Medicare cards? Card number 1 went to Harry Truman. Card number 2 went to Bess Truman. And that was the moment. It looks like a great achievement for the United States. Or was it? Well, some other things are pretty strange about the way that Medicare passed and some of the consequences that followed from it all immediately. As Shi and Singh point out, on the bottom of page 104 on the right and the top of page 105 on the left, something strange began to happen. Well, one of the first things that Shi and Singh point out is that Medicare and Medicaid were very different. Medicare had uniform eligibility. Medicaid had state-based eligibility. Medicare, physicians paid by Medicare were allowed to balance bill. That is, if they said the bill was $100 and Medicare paid only $60, they were allowed to bill the patient for the missing $40. This was not allowed under Medicaid. It was financed very differently. It was at the state level. And Medicaid reimbursement rates were very low. So even if you qualified for Medicaid, you might not be able to get a physician to give you the kind of attention that you needed. So this is also extremely important. They also say that Medicaid carried with it all the stigma of public welfare, which was very, very different. What is also very important is that soon after Medicare and Medicaid passed, there were major financial implications. As Shi and Singh point out, page 105, top left, not long after Medicare and Medicaid were in operation, national spending in health services began to rise, as did public outlays of funds in relation to private spending, et cetera, et cetera. National health expenditures had increased by 50% from 1955 to 60, and again from 60 to 65, but now it jumped to 78% from 65 to 70, and then another 71% from 70 to 75. And the percentage of the overall national health expenditure in the public domain, or paid for by public funds, also began to jump up very, very quickly, as we've already talked about some of the complications of that. Why was this the case? Well, all the reasons that we talk generally about what happens when you have public monies shoveled into private institutions was the case. Medicare reimbursements were extremely generous because those who created Medicare were very concerned about possible hospital and physician sabotage, even at this late stage. The opposition had been so severe, so strong, that the only way they knew to make sure that physicians and hospitals went along was to, as one of them put it, stuff their mouths with gold, make it so remunerative that they would only take it and take patients covered by it. There was also some very strange peculiar behaviors that were put into the reimbursement mechanism. And this is the so-called retrospective cost-based cost-plus reimbursement mechanism, which Shi and Singh talk about on page 229. And I'm just going to give you the bare outline of it now by referring to page 229. We are going to come back to this very soon because there were some major changes that happened to Medicare reimbursement by the late 70s and early 80s, which changed everything about healthcare financing. But here was the way that it was originally put together. It's on page 229 in the left column, cost plus reimbursement. Cost plus reimbursement was a traditional method used by Medicare and Medicaid to establish per diem rates for inpatient stays, etc. The method is cost plus because in addition to total operating costs, the reimbursement formula allows a portion of the capital cost to be used in calculating the reimbursement rate. It's retrospective reimbursement, it's cost plus, which means that all the incentives on the hospital in asking for Medicare money is to make care as expensive as possible. Because Medicare said, show me your cost for the previous year, let's say for 1967, and we'll pay you in 68. And whatever you present, we'll pay that, and we'll add some depreciation, your capital equipment needs replacement or repair, whatever. So we'll add to the cost, whatever it cost you, and then we'll add some more. What's the incentive if you're a hospital administrator? If Medicare is announcing to you, look at that page carefully, that we will pay you whatever your costs were and then add a little bit. You will want to present the biggest bill possible because Medicare is telling you in advance that we're going to pay it. You present it, we'll pay it. Is there any incentive to cut corners? Is there any incentive to be efficient? Is there any incentive to keep a patient for only 2 days? You can keep him for 5 or 10, even if he doesn't really need those extra days, because you're going to be paid for that. So the whole incentive structure, this cost plus retrospective reimbursement mechanism built into Medicare, was a formula for rapid inflation. Because whatever you presented, the incentive was to stuff it as much as possible, and Medicare is going to write you a check for that amount. Why would you do anything different? If you were a hospital administrator in that environment and you tried to cut corners and cut costs, you should have been fired because you weren't playing the game the way it was allowed. And you would have been doing your institution harm, at least in the financial sense. Those were the rules, and so you played by them. And that's why the spiral of escalation and inflation became so rapidly accelerated. This strange method of reimbursement. Now the question is, why the hell did the people who designed the Medicare program and the administrative rules and regulations that apply to it, why did they do such a clearly dumb thing? It seems so obviously dumb in retrospect. The way they allowed hospitals to stuff their bills and to pay them without a blink of an eye, without questioning, and then add a little bit. Why did they not see how stupid and dumb that was? I have a theory. No one knows for sure. My theory is that those people who were central to designing the actual administrative structure of Medicare and its reimbursement were those who had been through the wars from the 30s on to create a national health program, had been red-baited, had been attacked, had had physicians in hospitals tell them, we're not going to comply, we're going to sabotage, blah, blah, blah. They had been through the battles. They had been red scared. They had been baited. And so, this is meant metaphorically, not as a clinical diagnosis. My sense is, even though they had this powerful political force and coalition in the mid-1960s, joining force with the civil rights movement, liberal forces, a very strong liberal democratic Congress, even though they had all that, they were still, again, metaphorically, suffering from PTSD. They had been through so many traumatic events, so many traumatic battles, that they were having, in effect, not literally, flashbacks. It didn't seem like 65 or 60. It seemed like 35 or 45 or 48. And so they were scared. They acted, I think, in retrospect, irrationally. And they gave away the game to avoid what they assumed would be the new battles that would happen if they just even pinched one penny in that arrangement. They were still brutalized, battered, not really even in recovery yet, and so they felt that they had to bribe the hospitals and the physicians to go along, and created this clearly ridiculous and self-destructive mechanism for reimbursement that could only lead, and did only lead, to very rapid cost escalation. There's a perspective that a guy called Bruce Vladeck, who's a very important commentator on all this, shares. He shares that view, and he adds some other dimensions of sort of regretful retrospective criticism. Vladeck is someone you should pay attention to. You should read anything you can find by Vladeck. He is a very smart guy who has a PhD in political science, and he also has incredible experience as an administrator of very long duration. He was the director of CMS, which is the agency that oversees Medicare and Medicaid in the federal government, during the Clinton administration. So he actually administered Medicare and Medicaid. He knew it from the inside. And he had this very sophisticated political analysis coming from his PhD training in political science. He wrote an article that was published in 2001, looking back over what happened in Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. And I think his perspective is very, very important to reckon with. On page 155, this is an article that's on Blackboard, by the way. It's one of the readings, of course. You can get access to it. It says, Medicare's founding fathers, Oscar Ewing, I.S. Falk, Wilbur Cohn, etc., fixed upon hospital insurance for the elderly as the first small incremental step towards national health insurance following the defeat of the Truman administration's version of the Murray-Wagner-Dingell health legislation in 1949. And so these folks, having grown up professionally in a Social Security program that had been incrementally expanded and improved almost continuously since its enactment, they believed in small incremental measures. That's how we'll gradually get to national health insurance. We'll start with those over 65, and we'll build very carefully and cautiously because we don't want to offend anyone. He said, the question is, page 156, whether Medicare founders, that is, the folks he just named, caught up in the assumptions and preconceptions of a 15-year struggle from 50 to 65 to get Medicare, that they perhaps failed to seize the moment provided by LBJ's landslide, and were thus only too happy to settle for what Mills offered them, rather than what they could have gotten had they correctly read the nature of their political opportunity. They were faced with an enormous opportunity, with a strong Democratic majority, with the joining of civil rights forces. Everything was for them. Now's the time, go for it, national health insurance. Instead, they tiptoed, they were scared, they were fearful, they were still having, in my view, this is my language, not his, flashbacks of those battles, and they took the more or less timid road, and they made some very foolish decisions that were any smart person would have told them was going to lead to some terrible, terrible notions. And Flanagan, who is a liberal Democrat, wouldn't have been appointed by Clinton if he hadn't been to this important post, says, you know, the people that I don't like, the Reagans and the Gingriches that he talks about, they're the ones who saw in a change of political culture greater opportunities, more radical new visions. It's the Democrats, the liberal Democrats, who kept in the limited, narrow vision, couldn't see any transformative moment. And in many ways, those folks understood some moments of opportunity in the political domain that the liberals couldn't see, were afraid to see, just kept their heads down and plowed forward, waiting for the next assault to come to them. And so he ends his argument, his article, with a very powerful statement, bottom of page 160. He says, there are only two conclusions that one can draw from looking at these events. We should, first, consider ourselves lucky in this very conservative country with a well-articulated political mechanism designed to frustrate change, to have achieved Medicare at all, and to have protected it so far from the assaults of its unreconstructed opponents. That is, that we ever got Medicare for all its limits and defects. In this country, change your perspective, not a liberal, but a very profoundly conservative country. To have ever gotten there at all, we should thank our lucky stars. Now, we even got this weird partial measure. Or, the real take-home measure that he wants us to have. We had better make sure, next time we have a chance, to ask for too much rather than too little, as the executive branch did in 1965. If we ever have the chance again, and he points out that big chances seem to come every 30 years in this country. 35, Social Security. 65, Medicare. 94, all right, 1 year off Clinton's attempt. So that would mean another 30 years would be when? 2025? We better make damn sure the next time there is an opportunity and there is a buildup to ask for too much. We want universal health care now. Not too little and hide in the shadows and tiptoe, because you're never going to get there by that mechanism. So this suggests, in this very insightful view by a very astute political scientist, who was also a very experienced federal administrator who ran the Medicare-Medicaid program, that the United States is very different from other advanced democratic countries. And I think we're going to have to carry that message with us as we move forward and start looking at what other countries did, so that we can have a better sense of where we got and why we got there.